Oh, I just got the heat from that. I want the with love take on music, like why does this taste so good? What's so special about this? At 7:53 on the morning of 3rd December, news emerged from constitutional law offices that sent shock waves through royal circles on both sides of the Atlantic. Palace legal advisors had completed a comprehensive review commission in late November examining the constitutional mechanisms through which royal titles could theoretically be modified or removed. And while the review examined general principles, sources confirmed that the Sussex titles specifically had prompted the unusual assessment. The review that stunned royal watchers. The legal review itself was not publicly announced by the palace. Instead, its existence emerged through parliamentary channels when a member of the House of Lords during routine questions about royal governance referenced having been briefed on constitutional options regarding title holders who no longer performed royal duties. The oblique reference was enough. Within hours, constitutional experts and royal correspondents had pieced together that palace lawyers had been quietly examining what legal mechanisms existed for modifying the Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles. What made the review significant was not that such mechanisms existed. They did, embedded in centuries of constitutional precedent, music, and relatively recent legislation. What mattered was that the palace had apparently deemed the question important enough to commission formal legal analysis. Such reviews were not undertaken casually. They represented serious institutional consideration of options that until recently would have been considered politically and personally unthinkable. A BBC royal correspondent described the development as extraordinary in its implications if not its immediate effect. The palace was not announcing title removal. It was not a threatening action. But by examining constitutional frameworks seriously enough to produce legal documentation, it was sending an unmistakable signal that titles once considered permanent were in fact subject to institutional review under certain circumstances. Sky News assembled constitutional experts within 2 hours of the story breaking. The consensus among legal scholars was striking. The palace absolutely possessed authority to modify titles through several different mechanisms. Music, some requiring parliamentary involvement, others operating through royal prerogative alone. The question was never whether such power existed. The question was whether the institution would actually consider using it in the modern era against the king's own son and daughter-in-law. Across the Atlantic, American networks struggled initially to convey why the review mattered to audiences unfamiliar with British constitutional nuance. Titles seemed like ceremonial honorifics that could be adjusted at will. Constitutional experts had to explain that royal titles carried legal weight, affected succession questions, and represented formal relationships to the crown that could not be casually altered without following proper constitutional processes. What palace sources carefully emphasized, speaking anonymously to trusted correspondents, was that the legal review examined general principles, not specific individuals. But this framing fooled no one. General constitutional reviews of title modification mechanisms did not happen spontaneously. They happened when institutions were seriously considering whether circumstances might warrant using powers that had remained largely dormant for decades. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior officials who had been briefed on the review moved with careful deliberation. They understood that even acknowledging the review's existence would be interpreted as the palace positioning itself for potential future action. But they also understood that hiding constitutional examination of such significance was neither possible nor advisable in an era demanding transparency about how monarchy functioned. King Charles informed that news of the legal review had reached public awareness reportedly responded with weary resignation. He had authorized the examination reluctantly, pushed by advisors who argued that understanding available options was necessary, even if those options were never exercised. But he had hoped the review could remain internal, a theoretical assessment that informed thinking without creating public speculation about his intentions toward his younger son. William's reaction was notably different. Sources close to the Prince of Wales indicated he viewed the review's public emergence as potentially useful. If the institution was going to seriously examine whether title modifications might ever be appropriate, having that examination occur publicly rather than in complete secrecy served the broader goal of transparency about constitutional authority and its limits. Princess Anne, characteristically pragmatic, pointed out during a private conversation that the review's existence changed nothing about actual titles while potentially changing everything about how those titles were understood. If people recognize that titles are not permanent gifts, but conditional relationships to the institution, they may evaluate their use and misuse differently. She reportedly observed. By midday on 3rd December, as global coverage intensified, one truth had crystallized. Meghan Markle's title as Duchess of Sussex, once considered as permanent as any royal designation could be, was now publicly understood to be subject to institutional review. Whether that review would ever result in actual modification remained uncertain, but the examination itself represented a fundamental shift in how the palace was willing to think about and discuss title questions that previous generations would have considered too sensitive to acknowledge publicly. The constitutional framework that permits action. Understanding why Meghan's title could theoretically be in jeopardy requires examining the constitutional framework governing royal titles in Britain. A framework that combines medieval precedent, relatively recent legislation, and the evolving interpretation of royal prerogative powers. The mechanisms exist. The question is whether political will to use them exists. The primary mechanism governing most royal titles is the letters patent system. Essentially formal written instruments issued under the Great Seal of the realm through which the monarch creates or modifies titles. Letters patent created Meghan's title as Duchess of Sussex when she married Harry in 2018. And while letters patent are typically considered permanent, constitutional scholars have long recognized that what one monarch creates through royal prerogative, another can theoretically modify through the same authority. Historical precedent exists for title modification through royal action alone. In 1917, King George V issued letters patent that fundamentally restructured who could hold royal titles, stripping various family members of their German titles and dignities during World War I. The action was controversial but legally sound, establishing clear precedent that royal titles existed at the pleasure of the crown and could be modified when circumstances warranted. More recently, in 1996, Queen Elizabeth issued letters patent formally defining which family members would hold the style His Royal Highness or Her Royal Highness. The document established that children of the sovereign, children of sons of the sovereign, and the eldest son of the Prince of Wales would hold HR status. The specificity mattered because it demonstrated that even in modern times, the Crown actively exercised authority to define title boundaries. But letters patent alone do not cover all circumstances. When title questions involve potential wrongdoing or behavior deemed incompatible with holding royal dignities, Parliament possesses its own authority through the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917. This legislation passed during the same period when German titles were being stripped established that Parliament could deprive individuals of British peerages if they engaged in activities defined as demonstrating disloyalty or bringing dishonor to the Crown. The Titles Deprivation Act has rarely been used, and its application to Meghan would be politically explosive and legally complicated. Music. She is not engaged in activities that traditionally trigger such legislation: music, treason, fighting against British forces, or similar severe breaches. But the Act's existence in statute means that Parliament theoretically possesses authority independent of royal prerogative to address title questions if political consensus, music, supported such action. Constitutional experts examining the Palace Legal Review noted it apparently focused on a third mechanism, voluntary relinquishment encouraged through institutional pressure. This approach, less dramatic than formal deprivation, but potentially more achievable, would involve the palace making clear that continued commercial use of royal titles was incompatible with family expectations, then providing a framework through which Harry and Meghan could voluntarily request title modification rather than face more formal institutional action. Music. The precedent for this approach exists in Edward VII's abdication when he voluntarily relinquished one title to receive another, becoming Duke of Windsor rather than remaining king. While circumstances were dramatically different, the principle was established. Titles could be exchanged or modified through negotiated agreements that respected constitutional forms while achieving institutional objectives. And reviewing the legal team's constitutional analysis pointed out one crucial limitation. Any title modification affecting Harry and Meghan would not affect their children's eventual status. Archie and Lilith, as grandchildren of the sovereign through the male line, automatically became prince and princess upon Charles' succession, regardless of their parents' titles. Modifying the Sussex titles would not change the children's technical status, though it might affect whether and how those titles were actually used. William, who had been briefed extensively on constitutional mechanisms, recognized that the most significant aspect of the legal review was not discovering new powers, but documenting existing ones. The palace had always possessed authority to modify titles under various circumstances. What had changed was the institution's apparent willingness to seriously examine how those powers might be used rather than treating them as theoretical authorities best left unexercised. As the framework became clearer through media analysis and expert commentary, one truth emerged. Meghan's title as Duchess of Sussex existed not as a permanent right, but as a conditional dignity granted by the Crown, music, and theoretically subject to modification if circumstances warranted. The Palace Legal Review had made that constitutional reality explicit, music, in ways that could not be walked back or softened. The question now was whether understanding what could be done would lead to anyone actually doing it. The 5 factors, music, driving palace consideration. The decision to commission a legal review of title modification mechanisms did not emerge from abstract constitutional interest. It was driven by 5 specific factors that had accumulated through 2024. Each one raising questions about whether continued Sussex use of royal titles served institutional interests or undermined them. The first factor involved commercial use of royal titles in business ventures throughout the year. Harry and Meghan had been associated with various commercial projects, from Netflix productions to speaking engagements to charitable initiatives that also generated personal income. Music. While they had stepped back as working royals, they continued using their Duke and Duchess titles in professional contexts. Music, creating what palace officials viewed as problematic blurring between royal association and commercial activity. British constitutional tradition held that royal titles were granted for public service, not private profit. The expectation was that title holders either performed royal duties or stepped back entirely from using royal association for commercial purposes. Harry and Meghan's model using titles while pursuing independent commercial careers created what William described during one meeting as constitutional confusion about what royal titles actually signify. The concern was not simply aesthetic or traditional. It was practical. When the Duchess of Sussex title appeared on commercial projects, music, audiences naturally assumed some level of royal endorsement or association. music. This created legal and reputational exposure for the institution, which had no control over how titles were used, but bore consequences if those uses became controversial. The second factor involved international legal complications, particularly around dual citizenship and American residency. Meghan remained an American citizen living primarily in California while holding a British royal title. This unique situation raised questions that had no clear precedent. Could the United States government compel testimony from someone holding British royal titles? Did royal title protections extend to American residents? What happened if commercial disputes involving the Duchess of Sussex title ended up in American courts? Palace legal teams had identified several scenarios where Meghan's dual music status could create jurisdictional complications that expose the monarchy to legal processes it would prefer to avoid. The review of title modification mechanisms was partly motivated by desire to understand whether simplifying this complicated dual status through title changes might reduce institutional vulnerability. The third factor came directly from Westminster. Throughout autumn, multiple members of parliament had raised questions about why individuals who had stepped back from royal duties retained royal titles. The questions were typically phrased diplomatically, but the underlying concern was clear. Titles should reflect function, and retaining duke and duchess designations while explicitly not performing ducal duties created logical inconsistency. One particularly pointed parliamentary question in November asked whether the government had considered recommending that the Crown review titles held by non-working royals to ensure constitutional clarity about the relationship between title and service. The phrasing was careful, but everyone understood it referenced the Sussex specifically. The question had prompted palace officials to examine what mechanisms actually existed if political pressure for title modification continued building. The fourth factor concerned precedent. Palace advisors worried that allowing Harry and Meghan to retain full royal titles while living abroad, pursuing commercial careers, and maintaining independence from institutional oversight created a precedent future royals might seek to follow. What if George's younger siblings, music, Charlotte and Louis, eventually wanted similar arrangements, keeping titles and their associated prestige while avoiding the constraints of royal duty? William was particularly focused on this concern. As someone raising children who would face their own title questions, music, he wanted clear precedent established now that royal titles came with expectations, not just privileges. Allowing the Sussex model to stand unchallenged risked normalizing an approach to royal life that William believed ultimately undermined what titles were supposed to represent. The fifth and perhaps most significant factor was simply the accumulation of time without resolution. It had been nearly 5 years since Harry and Meghan stepped back. Initially, the palace had adopted a wait-and-see approach, hoping that time, music, and distance would clarify appropriate arrangements. But instead of clarity, the situation had generated continuous controversy, media speculation, and institutional complications. At some point, palace officials argued, indefinite ambiguity became more damaging than definitive action, even if that action was controversial. Charles, hearing all 5 factors presented during a comprehensive briefing at Clarence House, recognized that each concern carried weight individually. Together, they formed a compelling case that the institutional status quo was unsustainable. But recognizing unsustainability did not automatically generate the will to change it. Title modification would create its own problems, potentially worse than the problems it solved. The legal review could document mechanisms, but only Charles himself could decide whether using those mechanisms served the monarchy's long-term interests. The internal palace debate. The debate over whether to seriously consider title modification for Harry and Meghan split palace officials along predictable lines, revealing deeper divisions about how monarchy should adapt to modern circumstances, music, and whether maintaining family relationships mattered more than institutional clarity. Music. Charles' position throughout autumn had been consistent reluctance. He understood intellectually why advisors argued that title modification might serve institutional interests, but emotionally, music, taking formal action to remove or modify his younger son's titles felt like a final irreversible step that would permanently damage whatever fragile family connection remained. During one particularly difficult conversation, Charles reportedly told a close advisor, "I am his father before I am king. Must I really choose between those identities?" The advisor's response, though sympathetic, was firm. "Your Majesty, you chose when you accepted the crown. Every decision you make now is the king's decision, even when it concerns your son. That is the burden of the role." William's position was notably different. He had spent years watching the Sussex situation create continuous institutional complications while draining energy and attention from working royals' actual duties. He believed that clarity, even painful clarity, served everyone better than ongoing ambiguity. During a late November meeting with his father, William made his position explicit. "We can continue managing crisis after crisis, responding to each new Sussex controversy as it arises," he told Charles. "Or we can establish clear constitutional boundaries that define what royal titles mean and what expectations come with them. I believe the second approach serves the institution better, even if it creates short-term family pain." Charles responded by asking whether William truly believed his brother would accept title modification without severe consequences. The question was rhetorical. Everyone knew Harry would react with fury to any such action, but William's answer was revealing nonetheless. "Father, we cannot make institutional decisions based on fear of Harry's reaction. If we could, we would still be managing his desires to be half in, half out of royal life with full institutional support. At some point, the institution must define itself rather than allowing itself to be defined by the preferences of those who chose to leave." Princess Anne's contribution to the debate was characteristically pragmatic. She believed titles should reflect function and that retaining royal titles while explicitly not performing royal functions created confusion that served no one well. During a meeting where Charles expressed continued reluctance and was direct, "The longer we wait, the more politically difficult any action becomes." She said, "If you genuinely believe title modification serves institutional interests, delay only strengthens those who will oppose it. If you do not believe it serves those interests, then we should stop discussing it and accept whatever complications the current arrangement creates." The palace legal team's position focused on feasibility rather than desirability. They could execute title modification if instructed to do so. They had documented multiple constitutional mechanisms that would withstand legal challenges. But they also cautioned that the process would be complex, require careful sequencing of legal steps, music, and inevitably generate intense media scrutiny and public debate. Nothing about such action would be simple or quick. Queen Camilla offered an unexpected perspective informed by her own experience. Music. She had lived for years in a kind of tidal limbo. Married to the Prince of Wales, but known as Duchess of Cornwall rather than Princess of Wales, music, because of sensitivities around Diana's memory. She understood intimately what it meant to have title questions remain unresolved, how the ambiguity created its own problems over time. "Charles," she said during a private conversation, "you cannot protect Harry from consequences of his choices, music, by avoiding difficult decisions. At some point, clarity becomes kindness, even when it feels cruel." The debate reached its most intense point in early December when William presented what he called a strategic framework for thinking about title questions. The document, prepared with input from constitutional experts and communications advisors, outlined a phased approach. First, establish clear public principles about what royal titles represent. Second, communicate privately with Harry that continued title use while pursuing commercial independence was incompatible with those principles. Third, provide a time frame for voluntary relinquishment before considering formal modification. Fourth, if voluntary relinquishment did not occur, execute constitutional mechanisms with maximum transparency about reasoning and process. Charles read the framework multiple times. It was logical, carefully structured, and designed to minimize accusations of arbitrary action, but it was also a road map for severing his son's formal connection to the institution Charles led. Every instinct as a father resisted following such a path. Yet, every responsibility as king suggested that institutional coherence might require exactly the kind of difficult clarity the framework provided. Music. By mid-December, no final decision had been made. The legal review existed as documentation of possibilities, not commitment to action. But the internal debate had reached a point where everyone understood that continued inaction was itself a choice with consequences. The question was no longer whether title modification was theoretically appropriate. The question was whether Charles possessed the will to authorize it, knowing the family fracture it would create and living with the reality that some choices once made could never be unmade. The political and public dimensions. While palace officials debated title questions internally, external pressures continued building from both political and public spheres, creating an environment where inaction was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain as a viable long-term strategy. Parliamentary interest in Sussex title questions had been growing throughout 2024. Music. Multiple MPs, primarily from the Conservative benches, but with occasional support across party lines, had raised concerns about individuals retaining royal titles while not performing royal duties and pursuing commercial careers. The concerns were typically framed around constitutional consistency and public expenditure, avoiding direct personal criticism while making clear that the current arrangement troubled many parliamentarians. One particularly influential MP, a constitutional affairs specialist, had prepared a detailed memorandum in November, arguing that Parliament should consider invoking or updating title deprivation legislation to establish clear expectations for when royal titles could be retained and when they should be relinquished. The memorandum did not specifically name the Sussex, but its timing and content made the target unmistakable. Palace officials monitoring parliamentary sentiment reported to Charles that while no immediate legislative action was likely, political pressure was building to a point where the palace might eventually face formal parliamentary requests to address title questions. Acting preemptively through royal authority might be preferable to waiting for Parliament to impose solutions through legislation. The Crown would have limited power to resist. Public polling throughout the year showed majority British support for some form of title modification. A November survey found that 67% of respondents believed that individuals who stepped back from royal duties should not retain full royal titles, while only 19% thought current arrangements were appropriate. Music. The numbers were even starker among older voters, with 78% of respondents over 50 supporting title changes. What made the polling significant was not simply the numbers but the consistency. Music. Multiple surveys using different methodologies reached similar conclusions. British public opinion had settled into clear consensus that title and duty should align, and current Sussex arrangements violated that principle. American perspectives diverged dramatically. Polling in the United States showed much weaker support for title modification, with large portions of respondents either opposing such action or expressing no opinion. For many Americans, royal titles carried little meaning beyond celebrity branding, making questions about their appropriate use seem like arcane British obsessions rather music than substantive constitutional issues. This transatlantic divide created its own complications. Any palace action regarding Sussex titles would be understood entirely differently depending on which side of the Atlantic one stood. In Britain, it would likely be seen as appropriate institutional housekeeping. In America, it would be framed as the monarchy attacking Meghan, with all the cultural and racial dynamics that narrative would trigger. Harry's potential response to title modification weighed heavily on all calculations. Everyone involved understood that he would react with intense anger to any such action, viewing it as vindictive punishment rather than institutional necessity. His public statements would likely frame title modification as personal attack, emphasizing family betrayal and institutional cruelty while downplaying the constitutional reasoning behind such decisions. Music. More concerning was the possibility that Harry might respond to title modification with tell-all interviews or expanded memoir content, revealing private family information that could damage the institution far more than any title controversy. Charles, weighing this risk, found himself caught between institutional needs and vulnerability to his son's potential retaliation. Media reaction to news of the palace legal review split along familiar lines. British outlets generally treated it as legitimate constitutional examination, deserving serious analysis. American entertainment media portrayed it as further evidence of institutional hostility toward Meghan, and social media predictably divided into camps that saw title modification as either obviously necessary or obviously vindictive, with little middle ground between extremes. By early December, as all these dimensions converged, palace officials recognized that any path forward would be complicated. Maintaining current arrangements satisfied no one and created continuous institutional strain. But modifying titles would trigger family rupture, media firestorm, and public debate that might ultimately damage the monarchy more than the problem it solved. There were no good options, only choices about which set of consequences the institution was most prepared to endure. What this means for the music, Sussex future. As December advanced and speculation about title modifications continued dominating royal coverage, attention inevitably turned to what any such action would actually mean practically for Harry, Meghan, and their children. The implications stretched far beyond ceremonial designations into questions of identity, security, and the fundamental terms of their existence, music, as former working royals. If the palace pursued title modification, several possible outcomes existed. The most moderate would involve Harry and Meghan retaining their Duke and Duchess titles, but being formally requested not to use them commercially or in any context, suggesting official royal association. This approach would leave their technical status unchanged while establishing behavioral boundaries that, if violated, could trigger more severe action. A middle option would involve modifying their titles to non-royal equivalents. Harry could become simply Prince Henry, acknowledging his birth status while removing the ducal title created at marriage. Meghan could become Princess Henry rather than Duchess of Sussex, a title reflecting her marriage to a prince without carrying independent ducal status. This approach would maintain their connection to the royal family while removing titles most associated with representing the crown. The most severe option would involve complete removal of all titles through formal letters patent, leaving Harry and Meghan as private citizens Harry and Meghan Windsor. This option remained legally possible but politically nuclear, likely only if other approaches failed or if circumstances deteriorated dramatically beyond current tensions. For Meghan specifically, title modification would represent a kind of final institutional rejection. She had entered the royal family with tremendous optimism, becoming the Duchess of Sussex in a wedding watched globally. Having that title removed or diminished would symbolize the complete collapse of what she had once hoped to build within the institution. The personal and emotional implications would be profound regardless of the constitutional justification for their children. And title questions remain somewhat separate. Archie and Lillette's status as prince, music, and princess derived from their position as grandchildren of the sovereign, not from their parents' ducal titles. Modifying the Sussex titles would not automatically affect the children's technical status. Music, though it might influence whether and how Harry and Meghan chose to use those titles for their children in practice, the timeline for any potential action remained uncertain. Palace officials emphasized that the legal review was exploratory, not determinative. No immediate changes were planned or imminent. But having commissioned formal constitutional analysis, the palace had effectively started a process that would be difficult to indefinitely suspend without resolution of some kind. Watching this situation unfold, it reflects on how titles that once seemed permanent have become subject to institutional evaluation in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The monarchy is adapting to circumstances previous monarchs never faced. Family members who wish to be partially royal, who view titles as personal brands rather than public trusts, who believe they can redefine what royal titles mean rather than accepting institutional definitions. The fundamental question is whether Charles possesses the will to impose clarity when such clarity would damage his relationship with his younger son, possibly permanently. Every indicator suggests he would prefer to avoid such action, to continue hoping that time somehow resolves Oh, I just got the heat from that. I wonder with love take on, music, like why does this taste so good? What's so special about this? At 7:53 on the morning of 3rd December, news emerged from constitutional law offices that sent shock waves through royal circles on both sides of the Atlantic. Palace legal advisors had completed a comprehensive review commission in late November examining the constitutional mechanisms through which royal titles could theoretically be modified or removed. And while the review examined general principles, sources confirmed that the Sussex titles specifically had prompted the unusual assessment. The review that stunned royal watchers. The legal review itself was not publicly announced by the palace. Instead, its existence emerged through parliamentary channels when a member of the House of Lords during routine questions about royal governance referenced having been briefed on constitutional options regarding title holders who no longer performed royal duties. The oblique reference was enough. Within hours, constitutional experts and royal correspondents had pieced together that palace lawyers had been quietly examining what legal mechanisms existed for modifying the Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles. What made the review significant was not that such mechanisms existed. They did, embedded in centuries of constitutional precedent, music, and relatively recent legislation. What mattered was that the palace had apparently deemed the question important enough to commission formal legal analysis. Such reviews were not undertaken casually. They represented serious institutional consideration of options that until recently would have been considered politically and personally unthinkable. A BBC royal correspondent described the development as extraordinary in its implications if not its immediate effect. The palace was not announcing title removal. It was not a threatening action. But by examining constitutional frameworks seriously enough to produce legal documentation, it was sending an unmistakable signal that titles once considered permanent were in fact subject to institutional review under certain circumstances. Sky News assembled constitutional experts within 2 hours of the story breaking. The consensus among legal scholars was striking. The palace absolutely possessed authority to modify titles through several different mechanisms. Music, some requiring parliamentary involvement, others operating through royal prerogative alone. The question was never whether such power existed. The question was whether the institution would actually consider using it in the modern era against the king's own son and daughter-in-law. Across the Atlantic, American networks struggled initially to convey why the review mattered to